Have you ever had the person who is supposed to walk you down the aisle strike you across the face instead? I do not mean metaphorically. I mean a closed palm connecting with your jaw so hard your pearl earring flies across a marble floor. My name is Arabella Miller, and I was 29 years old the day my parents decided a $3 million trust fund was more important than my wedding. They pulled me aside before the reception even started. 300 guests were waiting in the foyer. My father handed me a pen and told me to sign my inheritance over to my older brother Harrison. When I said no, he struck me. He expected me to cry and surrender. What I did instead cost him his entire empire. Welcome back to QE Told Stories, the place where ordinary people face impossible families and prove that silence is not surrender. If you have ever been the scapegoat of your family, you are in the right place. Tell me your age in the comments and hit subscribe, because you will want to hear how this ends. It was 5 p.m. on a Saturday in October. The Ridgewood Country Club in Pennsylvania smelled of roasted prime rib and expensive floral arrangements. The string quartet had just finished playing their set. I was wearing a silk gown that weighed 12 pounds. Liam and I had just walked back up the aisle as husband and wife. We were supposed to be heading to the bridal suite for champagne before our grand entrance. Instead, a hand closed around my elbow. It was my mother, Beatrice. Her grip dug into my skin through the silk sleeve. She did not say congratulations. She did not tell me I looked beautiful. She steered me into the mahogany-paneled corridor just off the main foyer. My father, William, stood waiting near the double doors. Beside him was my brother, Harrison. Harrison shifted his weight from foot to foot in his rented tuxedo, staring intently at the baseboards. I stopped. The corridor was cold. Out in the foyer, our 300 guests were mingling, drinking cocktails, waiting for the bride and groom. "Make it quick, William," my mother said. She dropped her hand from my arm and crossed her arms over her chest. My father did not smile. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a folded legal document. He smoothed it flat against a small console table under a wall sconce. "We are doing this now, Arabella," he said. His voice was a low, steady hum, the tone he used when negotiating commercial real estate. "Harrison's bridge loan is due Monday. You are going to sign the transfer deed for the trust. We will have a notary backdate it to yesterday." $3 million. That was the number attached to Aunt Josephine's trust. It was the money my parents had been trying to pry out of my hands for 14 months. I make my living as a senior data analyst. My job is to look at complex systems, identify the breaking points, and predict the outcome. For over a year, I had been mapping the breaking point of my own family. I knew they were desperate. I just did not realize the depth of their delusion. They had timed this down to the minute. They believed that dressed in white tulle, surrounded by their wealthy friends, just minutes away from my first dance, I would fold to avoid a scene. They thought the social pressure of a high society wedding would crush me into submission. I looked at my father. I looked at Harrison, who finally raised his eyes but refused to hold my gaze. Then I looked at the silver pen my father was holding out to me. "No," I said. One syllable, flat, final. The strike came fast. The force of my father's palm against my cheek threw me off balance. My head snapped to the side. The hairpin securing my veil tore loose, sending the lace cascading onto the floor. My left pearl earring detached. It hit the marble with a sharp, hollow click. The sound echoed down the corridor. But that was not the sound that mattered. What mattered was the sudden, suffocating silence from the foyer. The heavy double doors had been propped open to let the waitstaff pass through. 300 people, including local judges, real estate developers, and Liam's quiet, kind family, had just watched William Miller strike his daughter on her wedding day. My mother covered her mouth. Harrison took a step backward, his face draining of color. They expected me to break. They expected me to run to the bathroom, fix my makeup, and emerge later pretending nothing had happened. That was the family rule: protect the image at all costs. Instead, I bent down. The silk of my dress rustled in the dead quiet. I picked up the pearl. I picked up the veil. I stood straight. The left side of my face burned a deep, stinging red, but my hands were steady. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown, pulled out my phone, and dialed one number. It rang once. "It is time," I said. I hung up. I did not look at my parents again. I turned my back on them and walked out of the corridor straight into the sea of staring guests. The crowd parted for me like water. Liam stepped forward from the bar, his face pale with shock, but I held up one hand to stop him. I kept walking until I reached the DJ booth. I reached over the soundboard and took the microphone. Behind me, my mother's voice finally broke the silence. A shrill, desperate shriek echoed across the ballroom. "Arabella, do not you dare." I flipped the microphone switch to on. Before I tell you what I said into that microphone, you need to understand why I was holding it. To understand the slap, you have to rewind 14 months. You have to understand the origin of the target on my back. My great-aunt Josephine was not a woman who baked cookies or knitted sweaters. She was a commodities trader. In the 1980s, she navigated trading floors in Chicago filled with shouting men betting on wheat futures and precious metals. She made a fortune because she possessed a unique ability to read the room, spot a bluff, and hold her nerve when everyone else panicked. She never married. She had no children. When she retired and moved back to Pennsylvania, she spent her final decade observing our family with the same cold, calculating eye she used on the market. My parents, William and Beatrice, spent their lives cultivating an illusion. They belonged to the right country clubs, drove leased luxury vehicles, and hosted catered dinners. Aunt Josephine saw right through it. She knew the cars were leased. She knew the house carried a second mortgage. Most importantly, she knew exactly who they had chosen as their golden child. That was my brother Harrison. Harrison was the boy who received a new sports car for his high school graduation, while I was told to apply for academic scholarships. Harrison was the visionary, the charmer, the son destined to elevate the Miller name. I was just Arabella, the quiet girl, the one who did her homework, stayed out of the way, and expected nothing. Josephine noticed. During Sunday dinners, while my parents fawned over Harrison's latest vague business idea, Josephine would sit beside me. We did not talk much. We played chess. She taught me how to anticipate 3 moves ahead, how to sacrifice a pawn to protect the king, and how to let my opponent defeat themselves through their own arrogance. She told me once that intelligence is loud, but wealth whispers. 14 months ago, Josephine suffered a stroke. She passed away on a Tuesday. My parents treated her funeral like a networking event. My mother wore black silk and wept delicately into a lace handkerchief whenever someone important walked by. My father shook hands, accepting condolences with the solemn nod of a man preparing to inherit an empire. They had already spent the money in their minds. I heard them whispering in the kitchen the night after the service. They were discussing how much of Josephine's estate they would allocate to Harrison as seed money for his future. They spoke as if the wealth was already deposited in their checking account. 2 weeks later, we were summoned to the law office of Nathaniel Pierce. Pierce had been Josephine's attorney for 3 decades. His office smelled of old paper floor wax and expensive leather. Mahogany bookshelves lined the walls filled with heavy legal volumes. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, its brass pendulum swinging in a slow, rhythmic arc. My father sat in the center of the plush leather sofa, resting his ankle over his knee, radiating casual confidence. My mother sat beside him, her posture perfect. Harrison slouched in a wingback chair, checking his phone, looking bored by the formality of it all. I took a simple wooden chair near the door. Attorney Pierce sat behind his broad desk. He was a man in his late 60s, wearing a gray suit and wire-rimmed glasses. He did not offer condolences. He simply opened a thick manila file. He read the standard preliminary clauses: funeral arrangements, minor bequests to charities, the settling of outstanding debts. My father tapped his fingers on the armrest, waiting for the main event. Then Pierce turned the page. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at me. I leave the entirety of my residual estate, Pierce read, his voice clear and steady, encompassing all liquid assets, investment portfolios, and real property, To my great-niece, Arabella Miller. The grandfather clock ticked. These assets, Pierce continued, are housed within an irrevocable trust. Arabella Miller is named the sole beneficiary. Full beneficial ownership is granted immediately upon my passing. My father stopped tapping his fingers. Harrison looked up from his phone, his brow furrowing, as if he had misheard a foreign language. Pierce looked down at the document again. Josephine included a personal note. I will read it for the record. It says, Arabella, you possess the two things this family lacks: quiet intelligence and genuine independence. Use this to secure your own future. Do not let anyone build a life on your back. Pierce closed the folder. He folded his hands on the desk. The silence that fell over that mahogany-paneled room was heavy and oppressive. It felt as though the oxygen had been vacuumed out. As a data analyst, I study baselines. My parents' baseline was poised superiority. In that moment, I watched their baseline shatter. My mother broke the silence. She let out a laugh. It was a brittle, forced sound, high and sharp like a porcelain teacup fracturing under pressure. Well, she said, her smile stretched tight across her face. Josephine always did have a strange sense of humor. Nathaniel, there must be a clerical error. Harrison is the eldest male. He is the one building a company. There is no error, Beatrice Pierce said. He did not smile. The trust is ironclad. I drafted it myself. There are no other beneficiaries. Arabella holds absolute legal ownership. My father uncrossed his legs. He leaned forward, the casual confidence gone, replaced by a dark, rigid tension. He looked at me. It was a look of total reassessment. I was no longer his quiet, invisible daughter. I was a vault he did not have the combination to. Harrison stood up. His face flushed a dull, angry red. Are you telling me she gets everything and I get nothing? You receive exactly what is written in the document, Harrison Pierce replied smoothly, which is nothing. The drive back to my parents' house was suffocating. Nobody turned on the radio. For the first 10 miles, the only sound was the hum of the tires against the asphalt. Then my mother shifted in the passenger seat. She turned to look at me in the back. Her brittle smile was back, but her eyes were calculating. This is quite a shock, darling, she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. A burden, really, for someone your age to manage alone. But do not worry. We are a family. We will sit down this weekend and figure out how we are going to share these family blessings. It is so important that we distribute this in a way that benefits all of us. She emphasized the word we. She laid it down like a snare. I looked out the window at the passing trees. I did not argue. I did not correct her. I just gave a non-committal hum. When we pulled into their driveway, Harrison slammed his car door and stormed into the house without a word. My father lingered by the bumper, his jaw set, staring at me as I walked toward my own vehicle. I drove back to my townhouse alone. That night, sitting in my kitchen with a cup of black tea, the chilling realization washed over me. I thought back to the law office, to the tight smiles, to the heavy silence. My family was not grieving Aunt Josephine. They had not shed a single tear for her passing. Instead, they were standing at the base of a fortress, mapping out a siege. They were looking at my $3 million trust fund and trying to find the weak point in the wall. I knew they would not strike directly at first. They would use guilt. They would use obligation. They would use the myth of family loyalty. And I knew exactly who they would use as their battering ram. Harrison. He was the golden boy, and his latest venture was about to become my problem. The siege did not begin with a battering ram. It began with a dinner invitation. 3 weeks after Nathaniel Pierce read Aunt Josephine's will, my mother called me on a Tuesday evening. Her tone was light, airy, and entirely devoid of the tension that had suffocated our drive home from the law office. She suggested I come over for a traditional Sunday roast. She said it was time we gathered around a table, healed our minor misunderstandings, and moved forward as a united front. I am a data analyst. When a system that historically operates on high conflict suddenly pivots to unearned harmony, I do not assume the system is fixed. I assume the system is setting a trap. I accepted the invitation. I wore a simple navy dress, purchased a respectable bottle of dry Cabernet, and drove to the house I grew up in. I treated the evening exactly like a hostile corporate audit. I arrived prepared to take mental notes. To understand what happened in that dining room, you have to understand my brother. Harrison lived in a downtown loft featuring exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows, a lifestyle subsidized entirely by my parents' quiet borrowing. He called himself a founder. Over the past 6 years, he had launched a boutique craft brewery that never secured a liquor license, a cryptocurrency consulting firm that folded in 6 months, and a luxury pet subscription box that failed to secure a single vendor. His current venture was an app designed to disrupt local delivery logistics. He wore Patagonia vests and spoke in a constant stream of buzzwords like synergy, scalability, and paradigm shift. He wore the uniform of a tech visionary, but he possessed the business acumen of a casino gambler chasing a loss. When I arrived at the house, the dining room was staged with meticulous care. The silver cutlery gleamed under the crystal chandelier. A prime rib roast rested in the center of the mahogany table, flanked by roasted vegetables and expensive wine glasses. My father greeted me with a firm handshake. My mother kissed my cheek, her perfume smelling of roses and calculated grace. Harrison sat across from my usual chair. He wore a quarter-zip fleece, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. He looked feverish, his eyes darting between me and our father. We ate the salad course in relative peace. My father offered polite inquiries about my job, pretending for the first time in a decade to care about database architecture and predictive modeling. My mother poured the Cabernet, ensuring my glass remained full. The artificial warmth was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. When the main course was served, the pivot occurred. My father cleared his throat, setting his heavy silver fork down on the porcelain plate. He looked at Harrison, giving a subtle, authorizing nod. Harrison reached into his leather messenger bag resting on the floor. He produced a sleek silver tablet and slid it across the polished mahogany surface until it stopped inches from my plate. The screen illuminated, displaying a presentation deck titled Next Generation Logistics. "I have been doing some incredible things," Arabella Harrison said. His voice was pitched high, laced with a frantic energy. "We are positioned for a Series A funding round by the third quarter. The user engagement is off the charts. The market share is ripe for capture. But to scale properly, to truly dominate the sector before the big players notice us, I need to execute a bridge round." My father leaned back in his chair, swirling the dark wine in his glass. "It is a brilliant concept," he said, his voice rumbling with manufactured authority. "I have reviewed the projections myself. The return on investment is guaranteed within 18 months. My mother rested her chin on her clasped hands, beaming at me across the table. "We thought, since you have recently come into such a substantial position of liquidity, this would be a beautiful opportunity. Keeping the wealth inside our circle, family investing in family." I looked down at the tablet. The final slide displayed a single, bold number, $750,000. They did not view me as an investor. They viewed me as an automated teller machine, and they were attempting to punch in their PIN code. I did not touch the tablet. I picked up my knife and sliced a precise piece of prime rib. I chewed it slowly, letting the silence stretch across the dining room. I swallowed, took a sip of the Cabernet, and looked directly into Harrison's eager, desperate eyes. "What is your customer acquisition cost?" I asked. Harrison blinked. The question disrupted his rehearsed script. He stammered for a second before throwing out a vague estimate about marketing budgets and social media outreach. "That is a budget, Harrison," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat. I asked for the metric. "How much does it cost you to acquire a single active user? What is your monthly burn rate? What is your churn percentage?" My father frowned. "Arabella, do not interrogate your brother. He is offering you a ground floor opportunity." "I am asking basic operational questions," I replied. I looked back at Harrison. "Let me save you the trouble. I looked up your corporate filings and tracked your app downloads last week. You are spending $42 to acquire a user who generates $12 in gross revenue before abandoning the platform. You are not scaling a business. You are subsidizing a flawed product. For every dollar you secure, you incinerate 3. The color drained from Harrison's face. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Handing you $750,000 will not bridge a gap, I stated calmly. It will only widen a sinkhole. The mathematics are impossible. The answer is no. The transition in the room was instantaneous. The facade of the loving family dinner shattered, replaced by active emotional warfare. Harrison's hand shot out and grabbed his wine glass. He did not pick it up to drink. He anchored it to the table. His fingers curled around the delicate crystal stem. He squeezed. I watched the skin across his knuckles stretch tight, turning a stark bone white. The stem trembled under the pressure. I waited for the glass to snap and slice his palm open. "You smug, calculated little bean counter," Harrison hissed, his voice dropping into a venomous whisper. "You do not understand vision. You sit in a cubicle and play with spreadsheets while real entrepreneurs take risks. You owe me this. Josephine stole my future to hand it to a glorified secretary." My father slammed his hand onto the table. The silverware rattled against the plates. "You will show some respect for your brother's ambition, Arabella," he barked. "We raised you to support this family." My mother dropped her linen napkin onto her half-eaten meal. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into cold, hard slits. The charity gala smile vanished, leaving behind the cruel, calculating woman Aunt Josephine had always warned me about. "You are a cold, selfish girl," Beatrice said. Her voice did not shout. It cut like a scalpel. "You have always been selfish. We invite you into our home. We offer you a chance to be part of something meaningful, and you sit there dissecting your brother like a specimen. You would rather hoard Josephine's money and watch your own flesh and blood fail than lift a single finger to help us. You are punishing us because you were jealous of him your entire life." I listened to their attacks without blinking. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my career. I did not explain that boundaries are not punishments. I simply absorbed the data. The data told me that my parents did not just prefer my brother, they were willing to drain my life to sustain his illusions. I picked up my napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my plate. I stood up from the mahogany table. "Thank you for the roast, Mother," I said. It was cooked perfectly. I turned and walked out of the dining room. I heard my father shout my name, demanding I come back and sit down. I ignored him. I retrieved my coat from the foyer, walked out into the cool October night, and drove back to my townhouse. I did not cry on the drive home. I felt a strange, chilling clarity. The lines were drawn. The passive resentment had officially evolved into a targeted extraction campaign. They had tried the direct approach, and I had shut the door in their faces. I knew they would not stop. They would simply find a back door. At midnight, I was lying in bed reading a novel when my phone screen illuminated the dark room. It vibrated against the nightstand. I picked it up. There was a single text message from Harrison. "You are going to regret turning your back on blood." I locked the screen and set the phone face down. Harrison was foolish enough to put threats in writing, but my mother was much smarter than that. I knew Beatrice would not rely on shouting matches or angry texts. She would rely on strategy. She would wait for a moment when I was vulnerable, when I was distracted by something beautiful, and she would slip a blade into my ribs with a smile on her face. I just did not expect her to use my own engagement to do it. 2 months after the disastrous dinner incident, the dynamics of my life shifted again. I became engaged. The man I agreed to marry was Liam Bennett. Liam taught 11th grade history at a local public high school. He drove a 5-year-old sedan, spent his weekends restoring antique furniture, and brought potted ferns to dinner parties instead of expensive wine. He was grounded, patient, and entirely immune to the toxic wealth sphere that defined the Miller family. He grew up in a home where people actually liked each other, which meant he viewed my parents' cold formality as a simple quirk of high society, rather than the symptom of a deep rot. I loved him because he represented safety. He was a fixed point in a world I had spent my entire life trying to navigate without a map. When I first announced the engagement, my parents' response was predictably tepid. My father asked about Liam's earning potential. Harrison snickered and made a joke about public sector pensions. My mother offered a tight smile and said he seemed like a very nice young man, infusing the word nice with a heavy dose of condescension. But a week later, Beatrice executed a hard pivot. The passive disdain vanished overnight. Suddenly, she was playing the role of the overly supportive, fiercely protective matriarch. She called me daily to discuss floral arrangements, venue options, and catering menus. She offered to host a lavish engagement brunch at the country club. The artificial warmth that had preceded the dinner ambush returned thicker and more suffocating than before. I knew she had not experienced a change of heart. People like Beatrice do not undergo moral awakenings. They simply change their strategy when the current one fails. I accepted her phone calls, answered her questions about color palettes, and waited for the real motive to surface. The motive arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. My mother invited me over to the house for tea, claiming she had found a rare bridal magazine she wanted us to look through together. When I arrived, there were no magazines in sight. Instead, she had set the kitchen island with her finest bone china. A silver teapot steamed in the center of the marble counter. Next to my cup sat a thick manila envelope. I took my seat on a velvet bar stool. I did not ask about the envelope. I let her initiate the sequence. She poured the Earl Grey, added a sugar cube to my cup, and placed her hand gently over mine. Her skin was cool to the touch. "Arabella, darling," she began, her tone dripping with manufactured maternal concern. "We are so thrilled about Liam. He is a wonderful addition to our circle. But as your mother, it is my duty to look out for your long-term security. You're stepping into a new chapter, and you carry a significant financial portfolio." She paused, letting her eyes drop to the manila envelope, then back to my face. "Men change when money is involved," she continued, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "Even the good ones. We have seen it happen to so many girls in our social set. They marry for love, and 10 years later they are fighting in court to keep their own inheritance. You need a prenuptial agreement. It is simply standard procedure. I had our legal team draft a standard template to protect your assets from outsiders." She slid the thick document across the marble island. The irony was staggering. She was sitting across from me, warning me about the greed of an outsider while actively plotting to extract my wealth from the inside. She was projecting her own predatory nature onto the man I loved. I did not argue. I did not defend Liam. I picked up the document and opened the cover page. "It is just a formality," my mother hummed, sipping her tea. "Standard asset protection. Just sign the last page, and I will have it notarized and filed for you. You will not even have to think about it again." I am a data analyst. I do not sign summaries. I read the raw data. I began reading. I read every single paragraph, turning the pages with deliberate, measured movements. For the first few pages, the text consisted of standard family law boilerplate. It detailed the separation of premarital property, the waiving of spousal support, and the division of shared assets in the event of a dissolution of marriage. It was exactly what a normal prenuptial agreement should look like. But deception is rarely placed on the first page. It is always buried in the fine print, hidden beneath layers of dense, unreadable jargon. I found the trap on page 14. It was a subsection labeled Article 7, Asset Consolidation and Management. The clause stipulated that upon the legal solemnization of my marriage, all separate property belonging to Arabella Miller would be transferred into a newly formed management entity for the purpose of cohesive tax strategy and marital asset shielding. The name of the entity was Miller Legacy Holdings, LLC. I read the subsequent paragraph detailing the operating agreement of this holding company. The clause explicitly named my father, William, as the sole managing member of the LLC. It granted him unilateral discretionary power to invest, liquidate, or disperse the assets held within the company as he saw fit, without requiring the consent of the minority shareholders. If I signed this document, I would not be protecting my $3 million trust from Liam. I would be legally handing the entire fortune to my father on my wedding day. They had hidden a financial surrender document inside a Trojan horse of maternal concern. I kept my face perfectly neutral. I did not gasp. I did not throw the paper back at her. I simply lowered my eyes to the very bottom of page 14. There, printed in tiny 8-point font, was the footer indicating the origin of the document. It did not name a family law practitioner. It read, Vanderbilt and Hayes, Attorneys at Law. That was the exact firm my father used to handle his commercial real estate acquisitions. They were corporate sharks who specialized in hostile takeovers and aggressive mergers. My mother had not asked a family lawyer to draft a marital protection contract. My father had ordered his corporate litigators to draft an asset acquisition trap. I closed the document. I aligned the edges of the paper until they were perfectly flush. I looked up at Beatrice. She was holding her teacup halfway to her mouth, her eyes searching my face for any sign of alarm. The kitchen was entirely quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. "This makes a great deal of sense, Mother," I said. My voice was smooth, polished, and entirely devoid of emotion. "You are right to be cautious. Asset shielding is a practical step." She exhaled a long, shaky breath, her shoulders dropping an inch. The relief on her face was palpable. "I knew you would understand, darling. You were always our logical girl. Just initial the margins and sign the back." I tucked the thick stack of paper back into the manila envelope and rested my hand on top of it. "I will not sign it today," I replied, offering her a bright, empty smile. A legal contract involving a marriage requires both parties to review it. I'm going to take this home, sit down with Liam, and have him look it over. Once he is comfortable with the terms, I will bring it back signed. The color vanished from her cheeks. The teacup clattered slightly as she set it down on the saucer. "Arabella, there is no need to trouble Liam with this," she urged, her voice tight. "It might offend him. It might make him feel as though we do not trust him. It is better to handle these family matters privately, just between us." "I appreciate your concern for his feelings," I said, standing up from the velvet bar stool and picking up the envelope. "But Liam and I are building a partnership based on total transparency. He will understand. Thank you for the tea, Mother. The blend was excellent." I walked out of the kitchen, leaving her staring after me in stunned silence. I walked out the front door, climbed into my car, and drove away from the neighborhood. I did not drive to my townhouse. I did not drive to Liam's school. I merged onto the highway and drove straight to the law office of Nathaniel Pierce. When I arrived, his secretary recognized me and ushered me into the mahogany-paneled room immediately. Attorney Pierce was reviewing a brief behind his broad desk. He looked up, assessing my demeanor. I placed the manila envelope on his desk and slid it across the polished wood. My parents just tried to trick me into signing away Aunt Josephine's trust using a fraudulent prenuptial agreement drafted by corporate real estate lawyers, I stated. Pierce did not act surprised. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, opened the envelope, and flipped directly to the back pages. His eyes scanned the heavy legal text. When he reached page 14, he let out a low, humorless chuckle. Vanderbilt and Hayes Pierce murmured, shaking his head. They used property litigators to draft a family law contract. That is incredibly arrogant, Arabella. This document is a blatant attempt to establish a coercive financial structure. It borders on predatory practice. "I need you to build a defense file," I told him. "I need everything documented. The date, the source of the paperwork, the intent behind the LLC. They are escalating their tactics, and I need a legal shield ready to deploy when they cross the final line." Pierce closed the file and looked at me with profound respect. "Consider the file opened, but you must understand the psychology of cornered people, Arabella. If they cannot trick you into handing over the funds, they will try to force you. They will look for leverage." I nodded. I already knew what my mother would do next. The fake prenup had failed. Now she would target the wedding itself. She would use the venue, the vendors, and the guest list as hostages. She thought the threat of a ruined wedding would break me. She was about to learn that I was willing to buy my own freedom, dollar by dollar. I kept the fraudulent prenuptial agreement in a locked drawer at my office for 3 weeks. I did not mention it to my mother. I answered her phone calls about seating charts and linen colors as if nothing had happened. I let her sit in the uncomfortable silence of her own anticipation. People who rely on control despise silence. They interpret a lack of response as a sign that their target is plotting a counterattack. In my case, they were correct. Exactly 4 months before the wedding, Beatrice lost her patience. She called me on a Thursday morning while I was running predictive models on my dual monitors. I answered on the second ring. She did not bother with pleasantries. The manufactured maternal warmth had evaporated, replaced by a cold, transactional edge. "Arabella, we need to discuss the paperwork," my mother said. Her voice was clipped. "I have been waiting for Liam to review it. The legal team needs to finalize the holding company structure before the end of the quarter." I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair. I looked out the window of my office building. "Liam and I reviewed the document," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. "We decided a prenuptial agreement is not necessary for our marriage. We will not be signing it." The line went dead quiet. I could hear the faint sound of her breathing. When she spoke again, the mask of the protective mother fell away entirely, revealing the ruthless negotiator underneath. "You are making a very naive mistake, Arabella," she said, her words sharp and measured. "Your father and I have discussed this extensively. We are hosting a high society event. We are paying for a premium venue, exclusive catering, and top-tier vendors. We simply cannot, in good conscience, write checks to subsidize a marriage that refuses to implement basic family security measures." She paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "If you do not return that document signed by tomorrow afternoon, your father and I will withdraw all financial support for this wedding," she stated. "Every single dime. We will cancel the checks. You will have to figure out how to pay for your own party." She expected me to panic. She expected me to plead. In her mind, she held the ultimate leverage. Weddings are expensive, and she assumed I was relying on her checkbook to fund the single most important day of my life. She thought the threat of public embarrassment would force my hand. "I understand, Mother," I said. "Thank you for letting me know." I hung up the phone. What my parents failed to factor into their equation was my actual financial reality. Because I lived quietly, because I drove a sensible car and resided in a modest townhouse, they assumed I lived paycheck to paycheck. They forgot that I had spent the last 7 years working as a senior data analyst. I specialized in optimizing budgets for major corporations. I lived below my means on purpose. I possessed excellent credit and substantial personal savings. I did not need to touch a single penny of Aunt Josephine's $3 million trust to fund my own wedding. I had the capital to purchase my own freedom. The financial sabotage began 2 hours later. My cell phone rang. The caller identification displayed the name of our boutique florist, a sweet, anxious woman named Clara. I answered, and Clara sounded frantic. "Arabella, I am so sorry to bother you at work," Clara stammered, her voice trembling. "Your mother just called the shop. She canceled the entire order. The centerpieces, the bridal bouquet, the floral archway for the ceremony. She told me the wedding budget had been revoked and requested a refund on the deposit. I know how much you loved those white orchids. I just wanted to call and see if everything was all right." Clara sounded genuinely heartbroken for me. She pitied the bride, whose mother had just ruined her dream wedding. "Clara, please take a deep breath," I said smoothly. "The white orchids are still happening. My mother is simply stepping down from the planning committee. I will be taking over all vendor relations moving forward. What is the remaining balance on the account?" Clara hesitated, rustling some papers in the background. "It is $4,200, she said quietly. I opened my wallet, pulled out my black American Express card, and set it on my desk. "Are you ready to take down the card number, Clara?" I asked. Within 90 seconds, the floral bill was paid in full. I instructed Clara to remove Beatrice Miller from the authorized contact list and requested that any future communication go directly to my personal email. Clara sounded immensely relieved, thanking me profusely before hanging up. I did not stop there. I spent my entire lunch hour executing a silent, sweeping financial takeover. I called the Ridgewood Country Club and spoke to the event coordinator. I informed him that my father was no longer the financial sponsor for the event. I paid the venue balance using a certified bank transfer and signed a new contract establishing myself as the sole client. I repeated this exact process with the caterer, the string quartet, the photographer, and the bakery. By 2 p.m, my parents possessed zero financial leverage over my wedding. They were locked out of every contract. The event belonged entirely to me. I did not call my mother to inform her of this development. I preferred to let her discover her own irrelevance in person. The opportunity presented itself the following afternoon. It was the date of my final dress fitting. The bridal boutique was located in a high-end shopping district. The owner, a sophisticated woman named Madeline, had imported my silk Mikado gown directly from Milan. The remaining balance on the dress was $12,000. My mother was scheduled to attend the fitting and pay the final invoice. She believed this would be the moment of my surrender. I arrived at the boutique 30 minutes early. I walked straight to the front desk, handed Madeline my credit card, and paid the $12,000. I also signed an exclusivity waiver, ensuring nobody else could alter the pickup instructions. When Beatrice finally walked through the glass doors of the boutique, I was already standing on the circular pedestal in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirrors. The seamstress was kneeling beside me, pinning the hem of the heavy silk skirt. My mother strutted into the room carrying her designer handbag, her chin held high. She wore a look of triumphant pity. She expected to find a weeping, compliant daughter ready to beg for the dress. "Arabella, darling," my mother sighed, walking toward the viewing sofa. She crossed her legs and placed her hands neatly in her lap. "I hope you have had time to think about our conversation yesterday. It breaks my heart to see you in such a stressful situation. But choices have consequences. Are you ready to be reasonable?" I did not turn around. I looked at her reflection in the mirror. My expression remained serene and unbothered. "I am perfectly reasonable, Mother," I replied. "The hem looks wonderful, do you not think?" Beatrice frowned, confused by my calm demeanor. She looked around the room, waiting for the boutique owner to approach with a clipboard and demand payment. Madeline stepped out from the back office, holding a glass of sparkling cider. She walked over to the pedestal and offered the glass to me with a warm, genuine smile. "You look breathtaking," Arabella Madeline beamed. "And I want to personally thank you for settling the account so promptly today. It is always a pleasure working with a bride who handles her own business. The receipt has already been emailed to you. Your gown is fully paid for and belongs exclusively to you." The color drained from my mother's face. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes darted from Madeline to me, processing the reality of the situation. "Paid for," Beatrice echoed her voice, lacking its usual smooth polish. "Yes, Mother," I said, taking a sip of the cider. "And Clara says the white orchids will be arriving fresh on the morning of the ceremony. The country club is also fully secured. You do not need to worry about writing any checks. You are attending this wedding strictly as a guest." The silence in the bridal boutique was profound. The seamstress kept pinning the silk, oblivious to the warfare occurring above her head. Beatrice stared at my reflection. She realized the financial leash had been cut. Her primary method of control had dissolved. She could not cancel the venue. She could not hold my dress hostage. She had attempted to starve me out, only to discover I owned the grocery store. Her expression shifted from smug superiority to genuine panic. If she could not coerce me through wedding finances, she had no mechanism left to secure the trust fund. Without a word, Beatrice stood up from the sofa. She turned on her heel and marched out of the boutique, the glass door swinging shut behind her. She was retreating to inform my father of their failure, but more importantly, she was going to have to tell Harrison that the polite extortion had not worked. Harrison was running out of time on his debts. With the financial leverage gone, he would no longer rely on our parents to do his dirty work. He was going to take matters into his own hands, and he was not going to be polite about it. The silence from Beatrice lasted exactly 4 days. For 96 hours, my phone did not ring. No text messages arrived regarding seating charts. No emails forwarded catering menus. I knew the quiet meant a structural shift in their strategy. My mother had realized the financial leash was severed. She could no longer play the elegant puppeteer from the comfort of her country club dining room. That meant the problem had been kicked down the hierarchy to the person who carried the actual deficit, Harrison. It was a Thursday night. I had remained at the office until 10 o'clock, running a complex predictive model for a logistics client. The streets were empty as I navigated the route back to my townhouse. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and damp asphalt. I pulled into my driveway, the amber glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. My headlights swept over the concrete steps leading to my front door. A figure was sitting on the top step, hunched forward, elbows resting on his knees. I shifted the car into park, but left the engine running. I watched him through the windshield. Harrison did not look like the polished visionary who had pitched me his startup at the mahogany dining table. His posture was slumped. The expensive Patagonia vest he always wore was wrinkled and unzipped. I turned off the ignition, picked up my purse, and stepped out into the cool night air. The smell of stale bourbon hit me before he even spoke. It was a thick, sour odor that clung to his clothes. "You think you are so clever, Arabella," he muttered. He did not look up. His voice was slurred, thick with intoxication and exhaustion. I stood by the driver's side door. I kept my keys gripped in my right hand. I did not move toward the porch. I maintained a calculated distance. "It is late, Harrison," I said. My tone remained flat, devoid of the emotional response he was seeking. "You should call a rideshare and go home." He stood up. His movements were uncoordinated, lacking his usual arrogant grace. He stumbled down the concrete steps, his leather shoes scuffing against the pavement. "Do not lecture me," he spat, closing the distance between us. "You have been lecturing everyone. Mom is having a breakdown because you humiliated her at the bridal boutique. You think paying a florist makes you powerful. You think because Aunt Josephine handed you a winning lottery ticket, you can look down on the rest of us." I watched his chest heave. The tech jargon was gone. The corporate buzzwords like synergy and scalability had vanished. Stripped of his rehearsed presentation, Harrison was nothing more than a frightened man drowning in a deficit he could not manage. "What do you want, Harrison?" I asked. He stopped a few feet away. The street lamp illuminated his face. His eyes were bloodshot. The manic energy that usually fueled his ambition had curdled into pure, feral desperation. "The app is dead," he confessed. The words tumbled out of his mouth in a frantic rush. "The Series A funding fell through. The venture capitalists walked away 3 weeks ago. The burn rate ate the capital. It is gone. Everything is gone." I absorbed the data. It confirmed my previous analysis. His business model was unsustainable. But a failed startup did not explain why he was standing in my driveway reeking of liquor, demanding access to my trust fund with such urgency. Normal entrepreneurs declare bankruptcy and move on to the next venture. Then declare bankruptcy, I told him calmly. Dissolve the corporate entity. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "It is not corporate debt, Arabella. You think I borrowed from a bank. You think I filled out paperwork for a small business loan." He took another step forward. I held my ground. "The bridge loan was not a venture capital firm," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I borrowed from private lenders, people who do not care about limited liability protections, people who do not send polite emails when a payment is missed. The principal is due on Monday, $750,000. If I do not wire that money, they are not going to take my office furniture. They are going to take everything." The truth was finally on the table. The guaranteed investment my parents had pitched over prime rib was a cover-up. They had tried to trick me into paying off my brother's unregulated, dangerous debts. "I need the trust," Harrison demanded. His tone shifted from a plea back to entitlement. "You have $3 million sitting in a secure account doing nothing. Wire the funds to my holding company tomorrow morning. I will pay you back with interest when I launch the next project. Just sign the transfer deed. I looked at him. I saw the panic, the entitlement, and the absolute refusal to accept accountability for his own actions. No, I said. Harrison froze. What do you mean, no? I mean, I will not set myself on fire to keep you warm, I replied. My voice was steady, anchored in absolute certainty. You made reckless choices. You bypassed legal financial institutions. Those are your consequences to manage. I am not draining my future to erase your mistakes. The answer is no. Today, tomorrow, and Monday. The rejection hit him like a physical blow. The desperation mutated into raw rage. He lunged forward. I did not flinch, but I braced myself. He slammed his open palm against the roof of my car. The metal buckled slightly under the impact. He stepped directly into my personal space, physically blocking my path to the front door. You selfish little he, started his face inches from mine. He began to pace the length of my vehicle, unable to contain the frantic energy surging through him. He pulled a ring of keys from his pocket, gripping them tightly in his fist. As he walked past the driver's side door, he pressed his hand against the car. He let the jagged metal edge of his house key drag along the glossy exterior of my sedan. The sound was a harsh, high-pitched screech. It was a physical manifestation of his entitlement, a deliberate destruction of my property because he could not control my choices. A long white scratch appeared in the dark paint running from the rear door to the taillight. I did not scream. I did not tell him to stop. While he paced toward the trunk, my right hand slipped into the open pocket of my purse resting on my shoulder. I located my smartphone by touch. I pressed the side button, holding it down until I felt the familiar haptic buzz indicating the voice memo application had activated. I began recording. I captured the sound of his ragged breathing. I captured the screech of the metal key against the paint. I captured the audio of a desperate man losing his grip on reality. "Are you finished damaging my property, Harrison?" I asked, speaking clearly so the microphone would pick up every syllable. He spun around, pointing the keys at me. "You do not understand how this works," he hissed. "You think you can just buy your own wedding dress and ignore the rest of us? You think this only affects me?" He stepped closer again, lowering his voice into a sinister, calculated whisper. The recording caught every word. "If I default on Monday, the dominoes fall," he said. "You have no idea what is actually holding this family together. If I go down, everyone goes down. Mom and Dad will make sure you do not get a happily ever after if I go down. Do you hear me? They will tear your life apart before they let me sink." He held my gaze for 3 agonizing seconds. Then he turned around and walked down the driveway. He did not have a car. He stumbled down the sidewalk, pulling out his phone to order a rideshare, disappearing into the shadows of the street lamps. I stood alone in the cool night air. I pulled my phone out of my purse and pressed stop on the recording. I saved the audio file to a secure cloud server. I looked down at the jagged white scratch running along the side of my vehicle. The damage was superficial. A body shop could buff it out in an hour. But Harrison's words were permanent. If I go down, everyone goes down. I walked up the concrete steps, unlocked my front door, and stepped into the quiet sanctuary of my home. I did not go to sleep. I went straight to my home office and booted up my computer. Harrison's threat echoed in my mind. He had explicitly linked his private, dangerous debt to our parents' survival. He had stated that his default would bring down the entire family. But why would a 30-year-old man's failed tech startup affect the financial stability of a couple who lived in a gated community and attended country club galas? The math did not align. Parents might mourn a child's bankruptcy, but they do not collapse alongside them unless their assets are intertwined. Unless the parents had funded the failure. My mother had tried to trick me into a fraudulent prenuptial agreement. My father had used his corporate lawyers to draft it. They were willing to ruin my wedding to get their hands on Aunt Josephine's trust. They were acting with the exact same feral desperation Harrison had just displayed in my driveway. They were not trying to save Harrison. They were trying to save themselves. I opened my web browser. I navigated to the county property records database, the civil court dockets, and the state corporate registry. I poured a cup of black coffee and cracked my knuckles. If my family was a failing system, I was going to follow the data trail until I found the root cause. I was going to find out exactly what kind of ruin my parents were hiding beneath their designer clothes. The dual monitors illuminated the dark room, casting a pale blue glow across my face. It was midnight, and the silence of my townhouse was profound. I sat at my desk with a cup of black coffee cooling beside my keyboard. Harrison had just left my driveway, leaving behind a scratched car and a chilling confession. If he defaulted on his private loans, the entire family would collapse. I make my living analyzing data. Data does not lie. It does not possess an ego. It does not attempt to manipulate you over a prime rib dinner or guilt trip you in a bridal boutique. Data simply exists, waiting for someone to assemble the pieces into a coherent narrative. I opened my web browser and began to assemble the pieces of the Miller family. I started with the county clerk's online portal. In Pennsylvania, real estate records are public. Anyone with an internet connection and a basic understanding of municipal filing systems can view the financial history of a property. I typed the address of my parents' estate into the search bar. This was the sprawling brick colonial home where they hosted their lavish holiday parties, the physical anchor of their country club identity. The search query returned 42 distinct documents. I filtered the results by date, sorting from the most recent filings backward. The first document I opened was the original warranty deed from 1998, confirming their purchase of the property. The second document was a standard deed of trust representing their primary mortgage. That was normal. Most American families carry a primary mortgage. Then I found the first anomaly. 7 years ago, they had taken out a home equity line of credit. They had drawn it to the absolute maximum limit. I cross-referenced the date of that filing with my own personal timeline. It coincided exactly with the launch of Harrison's boutique craft brewery. They had leveraged the equity in their home to fund his first failure. I continued scrolling through the index. The financial instruments became increasingly desperate. 3 years ago, another deed of trust was recorded against the property. This was a second mortgage, secured through a subprime lender known for exorbitant interest rates and predatory lending practices. Traditional banks do not issue second mortgages to borrowers who have already maximized their home equity. You only go to a subprime lender when traditional financial institutions close their doors. I checked the date. This filing aligned perfectly with the launch of Harrison's cryptocurrency consulting firm. My parents were not just funding his ambition. They were cannibalizing their own foundation to sustain his illusions. But the most damning document appeared at the very top of the list, filed just 8 months ago. It was a third deed of trust. This loan was not issued by a bank or a recognized financial institution. The lender was listed as a private equity consortium. I recognized the name from my corporate risk assessments. This consortium specialized in high-yield, short-term, hard money loans. They provided capital to desperate borrowers at punishing interest rates, using real estate as the collateral. I downloaded the document and examined the principal amount, $1.2 million. I rubbed my eyes, the blue light from the monitors burning my retinas. I pulled up a digital spreadsheet and began inputting the numbers: the primary mortgage, the exhausted credit line, the subprime second mortgage, and the private hard money loan. I added the $750,000 bridge loan Harrison had just screamed about in my driveway. I hit the sum function on my spreadsheet. The total debt liability was staggering. It hovered just below $3 million. The mathematics painted a horrifying picture. My parents' entire country club lifestyle was a fraudulent facade constructed on a foundation of toxic debt. They were driving leased luxury vehicles and sipping champagne while standing on the edge of a financial cliff. I opened a new tab and accessed the state civil court dockets. I searched my father's name, my mother's name, and the corporate entity Harrison used for his delivery app. The screen populated with active litigation. There were 3 pending lawsuits from unpaid vendors. There was a tax lien filed by the State Department of Revenue, and most terrifying of all, there was a notice of default filed against the family estate. The hard money lenders had initiated the preliminary stages of foreclosure. The grace period was rapidly expiring. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. The quiet hum of the computer tower was the only sound in the room. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. The targeted extraction campaign had nothing to do with greed. It was about pure, unadulterated survival. My parents had exhausted every line of credit, leveraged every ounce of equity, and borrowed from dangerous private lenders to keep Harrison afloat. They had reached the absolute end of their financial rope. Then Aunt Josephine passed away. She bypassed the golden boy and left $3 million in a secure, irrevocable trust to the invisible daughter. To my parents, that trust fund was not an inheritance. It was a life raft. It was the exact amount of capital required to satisfy the private lenders, clear the liens, and halt the foreclosure of their estate. They did not want my money to invest in a business. They needed my money to prevent the bank from seizing the home where my mother hosted her charity luncheons. They needed it to prevent their wealthy friends from discovering they were bankrupt. That was why my father used his corporate litigators to draft the fraudulent prenuptial agreement. That was why my mother attempted to sabotage my wedding vendors. That was why Harrison had ambushed me in the dark. They were terrified. They were watching the clock run out on their carefully curated illusion, and I was holding the only ticket to their salvation. They intended to sacrifice my future to save their facade. They were willing to strip me of my security, drain my assets, and leave me vulnerable just to maintain their status at the country club. I did not feel sadness. I did not feel the sting of parental betrayal. The time for mourning the family I never truly had passed years ago. What I felt was a profound, icy clarity. It was 3 a.m. The digital clock on my taskbar blinked steadily. I created a new folder on my desktop. I methodically downloaded every single public record I had discovered. I saved the primary mortgage, the home equity line, the subprime loan, and the hard money deed of trust. I saved the civil court dockets, the tax liens, and the notice of default. I combined the documents into a single encrypted PDF file. I attached the audio recording of Harrison threatening me in the driveway, where he explicitly linked his private debts to our parents' survival. I opened my email client and drafted a new message. I typed Nathaniel Pierce into the recipient line. I attached the encrypted file to the email. I kept the message brief and professional. Nathaniel, I wrote, the attached file contains the complete financial architecture of the Miller family deficit. The total liability mirrors the balance of Aunt Josephine's trust. They are facing active foreclosure. Harrison confirmed tonight that a private bridge loan is due on Monday. Their escalation is driven by a hard deadline. Please add this to the defense file and prepare the necessary countermeasures. I will see you on Saturday. I pressed send. The blue progress bar flashed across the bottom of the screen, confirming the transmission. The trap was now fully set. I had mapped their entire strategy, uncovered their deepest vulnerabilities, and placed the evidence directly into the hands of a skilled attorney. I shut down my computer. The dual monitors faded to black, plunging the home office into darkness. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the quiet suburban street. In 48 hours, I would walk down the aisle. The wedding weekend was about to commence, beginning with the rehearsal dinner tomorrow evening. My parents thought they were walking into a celebration where they could corner a compliant bride. They believed the social pressure of a rehearsal dinner surrounded by Liam's modest family and their own elite peers would provide the perfect environment for a high-stakes ambush. They were going to try to force a public surrender. They had no idea they were walking into a minefield. The rehearsal dinner took place on a Friday evening, less than 24 hours before the ceremony. The venue was a private dining room inside a historic downtown steakhouse, a location my parents selected specifically for its mahogany wainscoting and heavy velvet drapery. It was a room designed to project generational wealth. There were 50 guests in attendance. The seating chart created a fascinating sociological experiment. On one side of the long banquet table sat my future in-laws. Liam's parents were grounded, practical people. His mother spent 30 years working as a pediatric nurse, and his father managed a regional hardware store. They wore sensible clothing, laughed readily, and looked around the opulent room with genuine appreciation. On the opposite side sat the Miller contingent. My parents had invited their country club peers, the local real estate developers, and the board members of various charity organizations. These individuals wore tailored suits and designer dresses. They spoke in hushed, measured tones about stock portfolios and vacation homes. I sat at the center of the table next to Liam, observing the stark contrast. Liam's family radiated warmth. My family radiated a brittle, frantic energy. I knew the truth now. Thanks to my late-night data retrieval, I knew my parents were drowning in almost $3 million of toxic debt. I knew Harrison was facing a hard money loan default on Monday morning. Today was Friday. The clock had essentially run out. They had exhausted their private intimidation tactics. The fraudulent prenuptial agreement failed. The financial sabotage at the bridal boutique failed. Harrison's driveway ambush failed. They were backed into a corner, which meant they were about to deploy their final strategy. They were going to weaponize public perception. People who care deeply about their social image assume everyone else shares that identical vulnerability. My parents believed I would rather surrender my inheritance than cause a scene in front of Liam's respectable, quiet family. They intended to trap me in a verbal contract while 50 pairs of eyes watched. The first 2 courses proceeded without incident. Waiters in white aprons cleared the salad plates and poured expensive Pinot Noir. Beatrice played the role of the gracious hostess, directing polite, superficial questions toward Liam's mother. William discussed golf handicaps with a municipal judge seated to his left. Harrison, however, could not maintain the facade. He sat 3 chairs down from me, his posture rigid. He did not touch his filet mignon. He consumed 3 glasses of wine in rapid succession, his eyes darting anxiously toward our father. The perspiration on his forehead gleamed under the warm ambient lighting. As the waiters began distributing the dessert plates, the ambient chatter in the room reached a comfortable hum. The trap was ready to spring. William pushed his chair back and stood up. He reached for his crystal champagne flute. He picked up a heavy silver dessert spoon. He tapped the spoon against the delicate rim of the glass. The sound was not a joyful chime. It was a long, agonizing clink. The sharp, metallic strike cut through the low murmur of conversation like a blade. It echoed against the mahogany walls, demanding immediate submission. The chatter died instantly. 50 faces turned toward the head of the table. William offered a broad, artificial smile. He raised the flute, sweeping his gaze across the assembled guests, ensuring he held the undivided attention of every person in the room. Family and friends, William began, his voice projecting with the practiced cadence of a seasoned orator. Thank you all for gathering tonight to celebrate Arabella and Liam. We are bringing 2 wonderful families together, merging our histories and our futures. Liam's parents smiled warmly, nodding in agreement. They did not know they were being used as stage props. William continued, stepping out from behind his chair and moving to stand directly behind me. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. His fingers squeezed my collarbone, a subtle physical warning disguised as an affectionate gesture. When raising children, a father hopes to instill the values of loyalty and mutual support, he declared. We taught Arabella and Harrison that success is a collective achievement. When one family member ascends, they lift the others with them. That is the Miller way. He paused, letting the audience absorb the sentiment. Harrison stared at the tablecloth, his jaw clenched tight. Tomorrow my daughter steps into a new chapter, William announced, but tonight she has demonstrated that her loyalty to this family remains unbroken. I want to take this public opportunity to acknowledge an incredible gesture. Arabella has informed us that she is providing a magnificent financial wedding gift to her brother. She is injecting a substantial portion of her recent inheritance into Harrison's expanding logistics company, securing his visionary enterprise for the future. A murmur of impressed approval rippled through the country club guests. Liam's mother pressed her hands to her heart, visibly moved by the supposed generosity. The trap had snapped shut. William had constructed a brilliant cornering tactic. By announcing the gift as a finalized agreement in front of my new in-laws and the local elite, he placed the burden of denial squarely on my shoulders. If I corrected him, I would humiliate my father, embarrass Liam, and look like a petty, stingy sister on the eve of my wedding. If I remained silent, I would implicitly consent to the arrangement, giving them the leverage they needed to force the transfer on Monday. He squeezed my shoulder one more time, anticipating my silent surrender. I did not freeze. I did not shrink under the weight of the collective gaze. I am a data analyst. When an opponent introduces a hostile variable, you do not panic. You isolate the variable and rewrite the equation. I placed my linen napkin on the table. I stood up smoothly, stepping out from under my father's grip. I turned to face him, offering a smile that matched his own artificial brilliance. Before he could react, I reached out and took the crystal champagne flute directly from his hand. "Thank you, Father," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. That was a beautiful sentiment. I turned my back to him, facing the 50 guests. I raised the stolen glass. My father is correct about the importance of family values, I projected, ensuring my tone was warm and deeply gracious. But the true architect of my current position is not sitting at this table. The real gratitude belongs to my great-aunt Josephine. I saw my mother's posture stiffen. The polite smile on her face froze into a rigid mask. Josephine left me a profound legacy. I continued making deliberate eye contact with the municipal judge, the real estate developers, and finally, Liam's parents. She did not just leave me an inheritance. She taught me the critical value of financial independence. She structured her final wishes with strict legal boundaries, ensuring her wealth would be protected, properly managed, and never squandered on unsustainable ventures. I paused, letting the words strict legal boundaries hang in the quiet air. I glanced back at Harrison. He looked as though he might be physically ill. I intend to honor Josephine's legal directives exactly as she mandated. I stated firmly, the trust remains secure, intact, and dedicated solely to the future Liam and I are building together. I cannot wait to apply her lessons of fiscal responsibility to our new marriage. So please raise your glasses to Aunt Josephine. May we all possess her clarity, her foresight, and her refusal to entertain foolish investments. I raised the flute high. To Josephine, I declared. To Josephine, Liam echoed, instantly raising his own glass. The rest of the room followed suit. The guests murmured the toast, lifting their drinks and taking a sip. A polite round of applause broke out. Liam's family clapped enthusiastically, admiring the touching tribute to my late relative. The wealthy socialites nodded in approval, respecting the dedication to fiscal responsibility. They missed the underlying warfare entirely. To the uninformed observer, it was a graceful honoring of a deceased mentor. But the people who needed to understand the message received it loud and clear. I turned back to my father and handed him his empty champagne flute. His face had undergone a terrifying transformation. The artificial warmth had burned away. His skin was mottled, flushing a deep, dangerous shade of purple. The veins in his neck stood out in stark relief. His eyes were wide with a mixture of profound shock and barely contained fury. I had taken his public trap and dismantled it flawlessly. I had used his own audience to publicly confirm that the money was locked behind strict legal boundaries, neutralizing his false narrative without causing a crude scene. I had denied the transfer, insulted Harrison's business acumen, and claimed total victory while receiving a round of applause. William stared at me. He did not say a word. He did not need to. The hostility radiating from him was a physical force. He realized the polite extortion was over. The public pressure had failed. He had no diplomatic weapons left in his arsenal. I sat back down next to Liam. I picked up my dessert fork and took a bite of the vanilla bean cheesecake. It tasted spectacular. The dinner concluded an hour later. My parents did not speak to me as the guests departed. Harrison vanished out the back door before the coffee was even served. Liam and I walked out to his sedan, hand in hand. the cool night air providing a welcome relief from the tension of the private dining room. The war was now fully declared. My parents were desperate, humiliated, and out of time. Tomorrow was the wedding day. I knew the fragile peace of the morning preparations would simply be the quiet before the hurricane. They were going to make one final brutal attempt to break me before I walked down the aisle. The morning of the wedding arrived with pale, unyielding sunlight filtering through the tall windows of the Ridgewood Country Club. The bridal suite was a sprawling room decorated in soft ivory tones, smelling faintly of expensive hairspray, roasted espresso, and the fresh white orchids Clara had delivered right on schedule. 2 of my closest friends from the data analytics firm were serving as my bridesmaids. They sat on a velvet sofa, laughing over shared memories and sipping sparkling cider, entirely oblivious to the silent warfare vibrating beneath the surface of the day. For them, this was a celebration of love. For me, it was the final countdown to a detonation. At 10 in the morning, the heavy wooden door to the suite swung open. Beatrice walked in. I studied her from my position in the makeup chair. A data analyst observes the baseline and notes the deviations. My mother's baseline was immaculate, effortless control. Today, the deviations were glaring. Her posture was rigidly straight, lacking its usual fluid grace. The skin around her eyes appeared taut, and despite the flawless application of her expensive cosmetics, a profound exhaustion shadowed her face. The rehearsal dinner the night before had broken her confidence. The public toast honoring Aunt Josephine had cornered her, leaving her with no elegant exits. She was a woman staring at the collapse of her empire, and she had less than 6 hours to stop it. She carried a sleek leather portfolio under her arm. Beatrice forced a bright, fragile smile for the benefit of my friends and the makeup artist. She praised the floral arrangements and complimented the hairstyling with hollow enthusiasm. Then she executed her first tactical maneuver. She turned to the bridesmaids and the stylist, her voice adopting a tone of gentle, maternal intimacy. "If you ladies would not mind," Beatrice said smoothly, "I would love to have a few private moments alone with my daughter before we put on the gown. Just a mother and her bride before the chaos begins." My friends smiled warmly, gathered their belongings, and exited the suite, closing the heavy door behind them. The click of the brass latch echoed in the large room. The instant we were alone, the fragile smile evaporated from my mother's face. The atmosphere in the bridal suite plummeted, turning suffocating and dense. She walked over to the glass coffee table and placed the leather portfolio down. She unzipped it and withdrew a stack of legal documents. I recognized the formatting immediately. It was a transfer of asset deed, expedited and ready for a signature. She did not start with demands. She started with the performance of weeping victimhood. Beatrice sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her shoulders slumping. She pressed her fingertips to her temples, and tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her lower lashes with practiced precision. "Arabella, please," she whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured despair. "I am begging you. I have not slept in weeks. Your father is sick with worry. We are losing everything. The bank is going to take the house on Monday." She waited for a reaction. She waited for the instinctual childhood response to comfort a crying parent. I remained seated in the makeup chair, looking at her reflection in the large vanity mirror. My face remained perfectly flat. "You built a beautiful home, Mother," I replied calmly. "It is unfortunate you leveraged it to fund a doomed startup." The tears stopped instantly. The weeping victimhood routine required a sympathetic audience, and she realized the theater was closed. The transition from sorrow to venom was seamless and terrifying to witness. She stood up, her jaw locking into a hard, sharp line. She grabbed the transfer deed and took 3 steps toward me, holding the papers out like a weapon. "You think you are so superior," she hissed, dropping the volume of her voice to a sinister, grating whisper. "You sit there judging us, pretending you are above the consequences of the real world. We gave you everything. We paid for your education, we housed you, we introduced you to the right people. And the moment you secure a fraction of power, you use it to destroy your own blood." I turned the chair around to face her directly. I am not destroying anything I stated. You and Father signed the subprime loans. Harrison signed the hard money contracts. You engineered your own collapse. I am simply refusing to provide the bailout. Beatrice stepped closer, her eyes flashing with a desperate, frantic heat. When guilt failed, she pivoted to attacking my insecurities. She targeted the one variable in the room she thought I feared losing. You think Liam is going to stay with you when he finds out what you really are? She sneered. Her tone was dripping with disdain. You think that simple, naive schoolteacher wants a wife who would let her own parents lose their home. He thinks you are kind. He thinks you are a good person. Wait until he sees how cold you actually are. A marriage built on this kind of profound selfishness will not survive the year. He will leave you the moment he sees your true face. She expected the threat of abandonment to break my resolve. She assumed my relationship with Liam was as transactional and fragile as her own marriage. She did not know that Liam and I operated on total transparency. He already knew about the debts. He already knew about the fake prenuptial agreement. He knew exactly who was sitting in the room with me. Liam loves me because I do not operate in the shadows, I replied, keeping my voice even. He knows the truth. All of it. The realization hit her like a physical strike. The psychological breaking point had arrived. The manipulation had failed right at the finish line. She had no leverage left. The money was locked. The public narrative was secured. The groom was informed. She was a general standing on a conquered battlefield, commanding an army of ghosts. It was time to put on the dress. I stood up and walked over to the silk Mikado gown hanging from a padded satin hanger. The heavy fabric rustled as I lifted it. I will help you, Beatrice said. Her voice was devoid of emotion now, hollowed out by her defeat. I stepped into the gown, pulling the heavy silk up over my shoulders. I turned my back to her so she could fasten the back. She stepped up behind me. I felt the cold tips of her fingers brush against my spine. She gripped the metal zipper. She did not pull it up smoothly. She yanked it upward with a sudden, vicious force. The metal teeth scraped sharply against my skin, pinching the flesh near my shoulder blades. I inhaled sharply, but refused to cry out. Beatrice leaned forward until her mouth was inches from my ear. I felt her breath against my neck. You are a cold, ungrateful mistake, she whispered. She turned on her heel, picked up her leather portfolio from the coffee table, and walked out of the bridal suite, letting the heavy door click shut behind her. I stood alone in the center of the room. The silence rushed back in, filling the spaces her hostility had occupied. My spine throbbed where the zipper had pinched my skin, a lingering physical reminder of the hatred she harbored for my independence. I did not let the insult penetrate my armor. A data point designed solely to inflict pain holds no analytical value. I walked across the suite and entered the ensuite bathroom. The walls were lined with pristine white marble. I locked the door behind me and turned on the brass faucet, letting the water run to create a curtain of white noise. I opened the hidden pocket woven into the seam of my gown and pulled out my smartphone. I dialed the number for the law office of Nathaniel Pierce. He answered on the first ring. Are the assets secure, I asked, skipping the greeting entirely. The trust is locked, Arabella Pierce confirmed, his voice deep and reassuring. The countermeasures are prepped. The process server is on standby. We are merely waiting for the inciting incident. How is the atmosphere on your end? The pressure is critical, I reported, looking at my reflection in the vanity mirror. My mother just attempted a final coercion in the suite. When I refused, the hostility escalated. They are running out of options. They will attempt to force the issue again before the reception. Hold your ground, Pierce instructed. Do not sign anything. Do not engage in a debate. Let them make the error. I will be ready. I ended the call. I opened my messaging application and selected the conversation thread with Liam. We had anticipated a final ambush. We knew my parents would not surrender quietly, and we knew they would likely strike when they felt I was most isolated, caught between the joy of the ceremony and the spectacle of the reception. We had established a protocol. I typed a single word into the text box. Josephine. I pressed send. The word was the prearranged code. It told Liam the threat level was active, the final attempt was imminent, and he needed to maintain a watchful distance while I navigated the strike zone. I turned off the faucet. I smoothed the heavy silk skirt of my gown, adjusted the delicate lace of my veil, and took one deep, stabilizing breath. The ceremony was waiting. I was going to walk down the aisle, look my husband in the eyes, and exchange vows of loyalty and truth. Then I was going to turn around, walk back up that aisle, and face the detonation my parents had spent 14 months building. The conflict was primed to explode, and I was ready to light the match. The ceremony took place in the grand chapel adjacent to the country club. The air smelled of burning beeswax candles and the fresh white orchids Clara had delivered. The wooden pews groaned softly under the weight of 300 attendees. The organ music swelled, signaling the beginning of the processional. My father met me at the back of the nave. He offered his arm. To the assembled congregation, he appeared to be the picture of a proud patriarch, preparing to give his daughter away. To me, his presence felt like an armed escort. His fingers dug into my forearm, his grip unyielding beneath his tailored tuxedo sleeve. He leaned close, his breath warm against my ear, and whispered a promise through a forced smile. He told me we needed to finalize our business before the grand entrance. I nodded once, maintaining the optical illusion for the cameras flashing in the aisles. I walked down the aisle and took my place beside Liam. Liam was the only authentic element in the room. He grew up working summers in his father's hardware store, learning the value of tangible results and honest labor. He possessed no interest in the superficial metrics of country club society. When I reached the altar, he squeezed my hands. He had received my text message containing the code word. His eyes communicated total solidarity. We exchanged our vows, promising to honor the truth in our marriage. The officiant pronounced us husband and wife, and we walked back up the aisle to the sound of thunderous applause. The reception was scheduled in the main ballroom. The adjoining foyer featured soaring ceilings, polished marble floors, and tall windows overlooking the manicured golf course. The guests spilled into the space, retrieving their escort cards and ordering premium cocktails from the open bars. A jazz ensemble situated in the corner played a smooth, rhythmic melody. This brings the timeline back to 5 p.m, the exact moment the trap was finally sprung. Beatrice materialized from the crowd. She seized my elbow, her touch devoid of any maternal warmth. She steered me away from the double doors leading to the main reception space, guiding me into the mahogany-paneled corridor. William and Harrison were waiting in the shadows. Harrison looked wretched. The collar of his rented tuxedo shirt was damp with perspiration. He stared at the baseboards, unable to meet my gaze. William stood tall, radiating a chilling, calculated authority. My father reached into his breast pocket. He withdrew the folded transfer deed Beatrice had attempted to force upon me in the bridal suite. He smoothed the thick paper flat against a small console table beneath a wall sconce. He produced a silver pen. He laid out the terms one final time. He abandoned the rhetoric about investments and family loyalty. The masks had fallen away. He spoke only of survival. He stated that the hard money lenders would initiate formal foreclosure proceedings on Monday morning. He demanded my signature on the deed, promising to have a notary backdate the stamp to yesterday. He informed me that my refusal would result in their public ruin, and he would not permit me to enjoy my wedding reception while they lost their estate. The demand hung in the cool air of the corridor. I looked at the silver pen resting on the document. I looked at the 3 faces anticipating my submission. I delivered my answer. No. The word was a single, flat syllable. It held no anger, only finality. William reacted. The strike was swift, born of unadulterated panic and decades of unchecked entitlement. His open palm connected with the left side of my face. The impact jarred my teeth. The kinetic force sent my head snapping to the right. The delicate comb securing my veil snagged against my hair, tearing loose. The lace cascaded down my shoulders, pooling on the floor. The back of his hand caught my earlobe, dislodging the pearl earring. The pearl hit the marble. The sound was a sharp, hollow click. But that sound was immediately swallowed by a much larger, more terrifying phenomenon: the dead silence. The heavy double doors connecting the corridor to the foyer had been propped open by the catering staff. 300 guests had a clear, unobstructed line of sight. They had witnessed the patriarch of the Miller family strike the bride across the face. The polite chatter ceased instantly. The clinking of cocktail glasses halted. The jazz ensemble, halfway through a complex chord progression, stopped mid-note. The sudden absence of music created a vacuum in the cavernous hall. The silence was heavy thick, with shock and profound embarrassment. William stared at his own hand. The realization of his error washed over his features. He had spent his entire adult life cultivating an image of refined, untouchable wealth. In a fraction of a second, he had shattered his own carefully curated facade in front of his business partners, local judges, and the exact people he was trying to impress. He had traded his dignity for an outburst of feral desperation. Beatrice pressed her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror, as she looked out at the staring crowd. Harrison retreated, pressing his back against the wainscoting, trying to shrink into the shadows. The crowd parted. Liam moved through the sea of stunned guests. His expression was a storm of protective fury. He did not care about country club decorum or social graces. He was prepared to dismantle my father with his bare hands. I saw him approaching out of my peripheral vision. I needed the narrative to remain under my strict control. A physical altercation between the groom and the father of the bride would blur the lines of accountability. It would give my parents an excuse to play the victim and distract from the core financial betrayal. I raised my right hand, holding my palm outward toward my husband. Liam stopped dead in his tracks. He understood the gesture. He respected my autonomy. He planted his feet, serving as a silent sentinel while I managed the fallout. I turned my attention back to the floor. The left side of my face burned with a stinging heat, a stark physical contrast to the cool air in the corridor. I did not shed a tear. I did not scream or demand an apology. I bent at the waist. The heavy silk of my gown rustled in the oppressive silence. I retrieved the torn veil. I picked up the pearl. I stood tall. I leveled my gaze at William. The look I gave him contained no daughterly affection, no fear, and no submission. It was a cold, clinical assessment of a broken system. I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress. I withdrew my smartphone. I dialed the direct line for attorney Nathaniel Pierce. The line connected. "It is time," I said. I terminated the call. I turned my back on the 3 people who had tried to consume my future. I walked out of the corridor. The guests stepped aside, creating a wide, clear path. I marched across the marble foyer, bypassing the bewildered catering staff and the frozen jazz musicians. I headed straight for the DJ booth, positioned at the edge of the ballroom. The conflict had breached the containment zone, and it was time to share the data with the rest of the room. I stood behind the soundboard. The microphone felt heavy in my hand. The event DJ, a young man wearing a black vest, stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. He recognized a volatile situation and wanted no part of it. Out in the foyer, the sea of faces stared up at me. The silence was unnerving. 300 people stood frozen in various stages of shock, waiting to see what I would do next. Before I could bring the device to my mouth, a voice ripped through the quiet. "Arabella, do not you dare." It was Beatrice. She stood at the edge of the corridor, her face contorted into a mask of pure panic. The melodic, cultivated tone she used for charity events was gone. Her voice was shrill, desperate, echoing off the high ceilings. I ignored her. I flipped the power switch on the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," I said. My voice resonated through the premium sound system filling every corner of the grand ballroom. I kept my tone level, maintaining the exact cadence I use when delivering a quarterly risk assessment to a corporate board of directors. "I apologize for the sudden interruption to the cocktail hour," I continued. "As many of you standing near the corridor just witnessed, my father struck me across the face. I am sure you are wondering what kind of conflict provokes a man to physically assault his own daughter minutes before her wedding reception. The answer is not rooted in typical family drama. It is a matter of basic mathematics. A low murmur rippled through the front rows of the crowd. I saw Judge Harper, a man who had golfed with my father for 2 decades, lower his drink, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. For years, William and Beatrice Miller have presented a specific narrative to this community, I stated, looking directly into the crowd. They have projected an image of generational success, prudent investments, and unyielding prosperity. As a data analyst, my job is to look past the narrative and examine the raw numbers. The numbers tell a very different story. I gripped the microphone stand. I did not raise my voice. The truth does not require volume to be effective. The Miller family is insolvent, I announced. The murmur turned into a sharp collective intake of breath. In high society circles, insolvency is a cardinal sin. It is the one failure that cannot be forgiven or politely ignored. I decided to break down the deficit layer by layer, exposing the rot beneath their polished surface. My brother Harrison has spent the last 6 years launching a series of failed business ventures, I explained. His most recent endeavor, a logistics application, exhausted its venture capital weeks ago. To sustain his lifestyle and keep the company afloat, Harrison bypassed traditional banks. He sought capital from unregulated, private lenders. I shifted my weight. The movement caused the microphone to brush against a monitor speaker. A sharp, high-pitched feedback whine pierced the air, causing several guests in the front row to wince. The harsh, grating sound punctuated my next sentence perfectly. Those private lenders are demanding immediate repayment, I said, letting the feedback fade. The bridge loan defaults on Monday morning. The principal due is $750,000. The exact dollar amount hung in the air. Urgent whispers broke out among the attendees. Real estate developers exchanged knowing glances. The facade was crumbling in real time, brick by brick. But Harrison's reckless borrowing is only a symptom of a much larger systemic failure. I continued pushing forward, before the crowd could recover from the initial shock. William and Beatrice did not simply watch their son fail. They funded his collapse. They drained their own foundation to subsidize his illusions. I listed the financial instruments with cold precision. Their primary estate carries a maxed-out home equity line of credit I detailed. They carry a subprime second mortgage featuring exorbitant interest rates. 8 months ago, they secured a third deed of trust from a hard money consortium. That loan totals $1.2 million. The whispering escalated into a distinct, audible buzz. The elite peers my parents had spent decades impressing were now doing the mental math. They realized the lavish holiday parties and the leased luxury vehicles were funded by toxic, predatory debt. The grace period on the hard money loan has expired, I informed the room. The bank initiates formal foreclosure proceedings on their home this coming Monday. They have reached the end of their financial runway. I looked toward the corridor. William stood frozen, his face pale, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked like a man watching his own execution. Beatrice was leaning against the mahogany wall, weeping genuine tears of profound humiliation. 2 weeks ago, my great-aunt Josephine passed away, I said, bringing the presentation to its logical conclusion. She left her estate in a secure trust, naming me as the sole beneficiary. The total value of that trust matches my parents' debt liabilities almost exactly. The puzzle pieces clicked into place for the 300 guests. The expressions of confusion morphed into looks of dawning horror. My parents did not view my inheritance as a gift, I stated. They viewed it as a bailout. When I refused to hand over the capital, they escalated their tactics. My father utilized his corporate litigators to draft a fraudulent prenuptial agreement, attempting to trick me into signing away my assets under the guise of marital protection. When I refused to sign, my mother canceled my floral arrangements and threatened to withdraw funding for this venue, hoping to starve me into submission. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I funded this wedding myself, I revealed. Every contract, every vendor, every detail. They possess zero financial leverage over me. Today, they realized their manipulation had failed. They cornered me in the hallway and demanded I sign a transfer deed to save their estate. When I delivered my final refusal, William resorted to physical violence. I unclipped the microphone from the stand and took 2 steps forward, standing at the very edge of the elevated DJ booth. I am sharing this information to establish a public record, I declared, looking directly into the sea of shocked faces. I will not allow them to spin a false narrative about my departure. I will not allow them to claim I am an ungrateful daughter who abandoned her family in their time of need. I am a woman who refuses to be collateral damage in their collapse. The silence that followed was total. It was not the tense, uncomfortable silence that had followed the slap. It was the silence of undeniable clarity. The Miller family myth was dead. The autopsy was complete. Down on the floor, the paralysis finally broke. William snapped. The public exposure of his failure stripped away the last remaining shreds of his sanity. His pristine reputation, the only currency he truly valued, had just been incinerated in front of his peers. He let out a guttural, furious roar. He lunged forward, charging out of the corridor and sprinting across the marble floor directly toward the DJ booth. He intended to tear me off the stage. He never made it past the first row of tables. Liam moved with a speed and precision that defied his usual calm demeanor. He intercepted my father at the base of the stairs leading up to the booth. Liam planted his feet, squaring his shoulders, forming an impenetrable human barrier. William crashed into him, grabbing the lapels of Liam's suit. "Move aside," William snarled, his face twisted in rage. Liam did not yield an inch. He gripped my father's wrists, his forearms locking into place. "Do not take another step toward my wife," Liam commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Within seconds, 2 of Liam's groomsmen rushed forward. They were men who had played college rugby, possessing broad shoulders and a profound lack of respect for country club bullies. They flanked Liam, stepping up to create a solid wall of muscle between the disgraced patriarch and the elevated stage. William struggled, his polished shoes slipping on the marble floor. He tried to push past the men, but the groomsmen held him back, their expressions grim and unyielding. The physical altercation sent a fresh wave of panic through the guests. Several people backed away, clearing a wide perimeter around the struggle. The standoff was intense, a physical manifestation of the boundary I had just drawn. My father was trapped on the floor, surrounded by his ruined reputation, unable to reach the daughter he could no longer control. I stood above the fray, holding the microphone, watching the scene unfold with icy detachment. The truth had done its work. Now it was time for the law to do its work. William realized he could not breach the human wall my husband had formed. The physical route was blocked. He took a staggering step backward, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the pristine marble floor. His tuxedo jacket was rumpled, his silk tie knocked askew by the brief struggle. He smoothed his lapels with trembling hands, attempting to recapture the illusion of control. If he could not silence me with force, he decided to try silencing me with a counter-narrative. He pivoted away from Liam and turned his attention to the crowd of 300 frozen guests. "She is unwell," William shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. His tone was a frantic mixture of false pity and rising panic. "Do not listen to a single word she says. Arabella is suffering from a psychological episode. She has been under immense stress planning this event, and her mind has fabricated these absurd financial fantasies. The Miller estate is perfectly secure. My business is thriving. She is a liar." He looked toward the front rows, locking eyes with Judge Harper and several prominent real estate developers. He sought validation from the peers he had spent decades courting. "Harper, you know me," William pleaded, his voice cracking. "You know my portfolio. Tell these people my daughter is unwell. Tell them this is a delusion." Judge Harper did not offer a nod of solidarity. He He slowly lowered his highball glass, his expression a mask of profound discomfort. He took a deliberate step backward, creating physical distance between himself and my father. The other executives in the front row followed suit. They recognized a sinking ship, and none of them intended to drown alongside the captain. The silence of his peers was a devastating verdict. William opened his mouth to shout another denial, but the words died in his throat. At the far end of the ballroom, the grand mahogany doors swung open. The heavy hinges emitted a low groan that cut through the quiet room. Every head turned toward the entrance. Attorney Nathaniel Pierce walked through the doorway. Pierce did not walk with the hurried, anxious steps of a man arriving late to a party. He moved with a measured, unyielding cadence. Before establishing his private practice, Pierce served 10 years as a judge advocate general in the military. He possessed extensive experience navigating hostile environments and dismantling fragile egos. He wore a sharp charcoal suit and carried a slim leather briefcase. He was not alone. Flanking Pierce were 2 uniformed deputies from the county sheriff's department. Their utility belts creaked faintly in the quiet hall. Their expressions were stern and impassive. Trailing a half step behind the officers was a man wearing a windbreaker and holding a thick, oversized manila envelope. This was Marcus, a registered process server who operated with pragmatic efficiency. The crowd parted instantly, forming a wide aisle for the incoming procession. The guests whispered in hushed, urgent tones. The arrival of law enforcement transformed the social scandal into an official legal proceeding. William watched the men approach. The last remaining traces of color drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen gray. He recognized Pierce immediately. Nathaniel Williams stammered, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "Whatever my daughter told you, it is a gross exaggeration. This is a private family dispute. We do not need the authorities involved in a simple misunderstanding." Pierce stopped at the base of the stairs leading to the DJ booth. He did not acknowledge my father's plea. He looked up at me, giving a single, subtle nod of confirmation. The trap we had prepared weeks ago was finally springing shut. My great-aunt Josephine had predicted this exact scenario. During one of their weekly chess games years ago, she told Pierce that the Miller patriarch would eventually try to extract her wealth by any means necessary. She instructed Pierce to build a contingency plan. She demanded a legal shield capable of neutralizing a hostile takeover. Today, Pierce was executing her final directive. Pierce turned to face William. His voice was calm, carrying the weight of undisputed authority. "There is no misunderstanding here," William Pierce stated. "I received a phone call from my client informing me that an assault had taken place. I also have 300 witnesses in this room who watched you strike Arabella across the face. That elevates this situation from a private dispute to a criminal matter." William swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. "You cannot prove anything." "It was a reflex. She provoked me." "The law does not excuse physical battery based on provocation," Pierce replied smoothly. "Due to the unprovoked nature of your attack and the documented history of your financial coercion, a judge granted an emergency ex parte protective order 20 minutes ago." Pierce gestured toward the man in the windbreaker. Marcus stepped forward. "Process servers do not care about country club hierarchies. They do not care about luxury vehicles or exclusive memberships. They possess one singular objective, and they execute it without hesitation." Marcus walked directly up to my father. William raised his hands, trying to back away, but the groomsman blocked his retreat. "William Miller Marcus," said his voice flat and professional. Marcus thrust the oversized manila envelope forward, pressing it firmly against my father's chest. The impact produced a heavy, distinct thud. The sound was visceral. It was the sound of a carefully constructed empire hitting the ground. "You have been served," Marcus declared. William instinctively caught the envelope as it slid down his tuxedo jacket. He stared at the thick parcel as if it were a venomous snake. Pierce stepped forward, narrating the contents of the envelope for the benefit of the surrounding guests. "That packet contains 2 documents," Pierce explained. "The first is a formal cease and desist directive. It legally bars you, your wife, and your son from making any further demands, inquiries, or attempts to access the irrevocable trust belonging to Arabella Miller. Any future contact regarding those assets will be treated as targeted financial harassment. William clutched the envelope, his knuckles turning white. The second document is an emergency protective order, Pierce continued. It requires you to maintain a distance of 500 feet from Arabella at all times. Because she is currently occupying this venue, your presence here is a direct violation of a court mandate. One of the sheriff's deputies stepped past Pierce. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man who looked entirely unimpressed by the opulent surroundings. He rested his hand on his utility belt and fixed his gaze on my father. "Sir," the deputy said, his tone leaving zero room for negotiation. "You are trespassing and you are in violation of an active protective order. You need to vacate these premises immediately. If you refuse to comply, we will place you in handcuffs and remove you by force. The choice is yours." The reality of the situation crashed down upon the Miller family. The social leverage was obliterated. The financial manipulation was neutralized. Now the law was dictating their movements. Beatrice pushed her way through the crowd, rushing to her husband's side. Her mascara had run, leaving dark streaks down her cheeks. Her elegant updo was fraying. She looked wildly at the faces of her peers, searching for a single sympathetic expression. She found none. The wealthy socialites stared back with cold, clinical detachment. "William," Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling, "we need to leave. Please, do not make this worse." William looked down at the envelope in his hands. He looked at the deputies preparing to reach for their restraints. Finally, he looked up at me. His eyes were hollow. The feral desperation had burned out, replaced by the crushing weight of total defeat. He realized he had lost everything. He had lost the trust fund, he had lost his daughter, and he had lost his reputation in front of the only people whose opinions he valued. He did not say another word. He turned around. Harrison was already walking toward the exit, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in resignation. Beatrice linked her arm through William's, clinging to him as if he were the only stable object in a collapsing room. The deputies flanked them. They did not touch my parents, but their close proximity ensured compliance. The procession began the long walk across the marble floor. The crowd parted once more. This time, it was not an act of deference. The guests pulled their designer gowns and tailored suits away from the passing family, treating them like a contagion. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, save for the sound of their footsteps retreating toward the grand doors. They walked out into the cool evening air. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, sealing their exile. The tension in the room broke. A collective exhale rushed through the crowd. I stood in the DJ booth watching the doors close. I placed the microphone down on the soundboard. I walked down the short flight of stairs. Liam was waiting at the bottom. He did not ask if I was okay. He simply reached out and took my hand, his fingers warm and steady against my skin. Nathaniel Pierce walked over to us. He offered a small, rare smile. "The perimeter is secure," Arabella Pierce said quietly. "You handled the variable perfectly. Enjoy your reception." I thanked him. Liam and I turned toward the center of the ballroom. The jazz ensemble, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, picked up their instruments and began playing a bright, uplifting melody. The catering staff resumed circulating with trays of champagne. The guests, eager to move past the scandal, approached us with genuine smiles and warm congratulations. The wedding reception proceeded beautifully. We danced, we ate prime rib, and we celebrated the beginning of our new partnership. For the next few hours, the ballroom was a sanctuary of joy and truth. But beneath the music and the laughter, my analytical mind continued to process the timeline. The weekend provided a temporary buffer. Saturday night would fade into Sunday. Sunday would be a day of quiet recovery. But the inevitable rotation of the earth would bring the dawn of a new week. My parents had been escorted out of the country club in disgrace, their social standing annihilated. But social ruin was merely the prelude to the main event. The true consequences of their actions were not dictated by polite society. They were dictated by contracts, interest rates, and unforgiving deadlines. The hard money lenders did not care about the spectacle at the wedding. The private equity consortium did not care about the protective order. They only cared about the principal balance. Monday morning was approaching. The financial institutions would open their doors at 9 o'clock. The grace periods were over. The extensions were denied. The Miller family was returning to an empty estate waiting for the sun to rise, knowing the creditors were coming to collect the debt. The social facade had crumbled, but the systemic collapse was scheduled for dawn. Sunday passed in a state of profound tranquility. Liam and I spent our first full day as a married couple unpacking cardboard boxes in our new home. We had purchased a modest, charming craftsman-style house in a quiet neighborhood lined with old oak trees. It featured original hardwood floors and a wide front porch. It did not resemble a country club estate, and that was exactly why I loved it. The space belonged to us, purchased with honest savings and secured by mutual respect. Monday morning arrived with crisp, clear sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows. Liam kissed my forehead, grabbed his travel mug of coffee, and headed off to teach his first period history class. I remained seated at our butcher block island, wearing comfortable sweatpants and a loose sweater. I opened my laptop. The weekend had provided a temporary shield, a brief pause while the corporate world rested. But Monday is the day systems reset. Monday is the day ledgers are reconciled. I initiated the final phase of my personal severance protocol. For 29 years, my name had been tethered to my parents through countless administrative threads. I logged into my healthcare portal. I navigated to the emergency contact and HIPAA authorization forms. I deleted William and Beatrice Miller from the approved proxies list, replacing them with Liam Bennett. I clicked confirm. My smartphone rested on the counter. It emitted a crisp, bright ping. An automated email had arrived verifying the update. I moved to my life insurance policy. I removed my father as the secondary beneficiary. I routed the contingent assets directly into the secure structure of Aunt Josephine's trust. I clicked save. Ping. I accessed the family cellular data plan. I had remained on their shared account purely out of convenience, reimbursing them for my portion every month. I authorized a line transfer, migrating my phone number to a private independent contract. I terminated my connection to their billing cycle. Ping! The sound was incredibly satisfying. Each sharp electronic chime represented a severed chain. I was systematically revoking their access to my life. I removed their names from my emergency records, my financial accounts, and my medical files. With every keystroke, I reduced my parents from familial authorities to total strangers. By 9 in the morning, the administrative detachment was flawless. I existed entirely outside their sphere of influence. While I was enjoying the peace of my kitchen, my parents were waking up to a radically different reality. In the elite circles of Pennsylvania, gossip is a highly efficient currency. When a rumor involves infidelity or a minor social faux pas, it might take a week to circulate through the golf courses and charity boards. But when a rumor involves insolvency, the information travels with the speed of a fiber optic network. At the wedding reception, I had delivered a forensic breakdown of my parents' toxic liabilities to an audience of 300 people. That audience included real estate developers, municipal judges, and corporate executives. These were individuals whose own wealth depended on accurate risk assessment. They had witnessed my father resort to physical battery when confronted with his deficit. They had watched him escorted off the premises by county deputies. The executives did not wait until Monday to act. They made phone calls on Sunday afternoon. They called their personal bankers. They contacted their portfolio managers. They alerted the loan officers who serviced the Miller accounts. They warned their financial institutions that William Miller was a high-risk entity, teetering on the edge of a systemic collapse. By the time the banks opened their doors at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, the institutional panic had already set in. Financial institutions operate on a principle called cross-default. When a borrower breaches the terms of one significant loan, the secondary lenders assume total failure is imminent. They scramble to protect their investments before the collateral disappears. My parents had secured a home equity line of credit, a subprime second mortgage, and a predatory hard money loan against their primary residence. The Hard Money Consortium held the most aggressive terms. The grace period on their $1.2 million principal had expired over the weekend. My parents had failed to produce the capital. At 9:15, the consortium filed the official notice of default at the county courthouse. The document entered the public ledger. This action triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. The primary bank, spooked by the public filing and the weekend rumors, immediately froze my parents' home equity line. The subprime lender issued a formal demand for accelerated repayment, calling in their entire balance. An hour later, a courier parked an unmarked sedan in the circular driveway of the Miller estate. The courier walked up the manicured brick pathway, carrying a heavy-duty staple gun and a thick stack of legal notices. He bypassed the ornate doorbell. He raised the staple gun and drove steel fasteners directly into the custom mahogany front door, attaching the formal foreclosure documents for the neighborhood to see. The trap had snapped shut. The empire was burning, and the fire was fueled entirely by the oxygen of their own greed. They had tried to steal my future to prevent this exact scenario, and their failure guaranteed their ruin. While my parents were barricaded inside their home listening to the phones ring, the golden child was executing his own exit strategy. Harrison woke up in his expensive downtown loft. He checked his mobile banking application. The balance was negligible. The venture capital was gone. The bridge round he had promised his investors was a phantom. More importantly, the private lenders who had fronted him $750,000 were expecting a wire transfer. These were not men who filed paperwork at a courthouse. They were individuals who visited offices unannounced. They did not repossess assets, they extracted penalties. Harrison possessed a unique blend of arrogance and cowardice. When the pressure remained abstract, he acted like a visionary. When the consequences materialized, his first instinct was flight. He realized no bailout was coming. I had locked the trust. Our parents were currently losing their estate. He had burned every bridge and exhausted every line of credit. If he stayed in Pennsylvania, he would have to face the men he had defrauded. He did not call William or Beatrice to offer support. He did not attempt to formulate a repayment plan. He pulled a canvas duffel bag from his closet. He packed 3 pairs of designer jeans, a handful of shirts, and his laptop. He left his expensive espresso machine on the counter. He abandoned the mid-century modern furniture he had purchased with borrowed money. He walked out of the loft, leaving the front door unlocked. He climbed into his vehicle and drove toward the state line. He abandoned his corporate entity, his apartment, and his family. The son my parents had idolized, the boy they had ruined themselves to protect, fled the moment the bill came due. He left them holding the wreckage of his ambition. I monitored the public dockets from my laptop, watching the filings populate in real time. I saw the notice of default register. I watched the corporate status of Harrison's logistics application change to delinquent. The data confirmed the total annihilation of their leverage. I closed the browser tab. I picked up my coffee mug and took a sip. The roast was rich and flavorful. I felt no guilt. I felt no obligation to reach out and offer condolences. I had warned them. Aunt Josephine had warned them. They had chosen their path, and now they were walking it. However, I knew the psychology of a narcissist. A woman like Beatrice Miller does not accept defeat simply because a legal document is stapled to her front door. She had spent 30 years cultivating her identity around her social standing. The country club was her kingdom, and she still held a membership card that was paid through the end of the month. She would not surrender her crown without attempting one final desperate spin. She would try to rewrite history. She would attend her scheduled Tuesday morning brunch, sit among the elite women of her charity board, and attempt to cast me as a hysterical, ungrateful villain. She thought she could salvage her reputation with a few well-placed tears and a fabricated narrative. She had no idea I had already prepared the counterstrike. It was Tuesday morning. The formal notice of default remained stapled to the mahogany front door of the Miller estate. The heavy steel fasteners driven by the courier glinted in the early sunlight. Most individuals confronting a legal foreclosure would contact a bankruptcy attorney. Most individuals would begin assessing their assets and preparing for the inevitable transition. Beatrice Miller was not most individuals. She possessed a remarkable ability to compartmentalize reality. She believed that as long as she controlled the public narrative, the mathematics of her ruin could be postponed indefinitely. She stepped around the foreclosure notice without looking at it. She wore a tailored tweed skirt suit and her signature pearl necklace. She applied her expensive cosmetics with practiced precision, masking the exhaustion circling her eyes. She climbed into her leased luxury vehicle and drove toward the Ridgewood Country Club. It was time for her standing Tuesday brunch with the charity committee. She intended to execute a master class in damage control. The country club dining room offered panoramic views of the 18th hole. Beatrice navigated the room with her chin held high, projecting an aura of dignified suffering. She arrived at her usual corner table. 3 of her closest associates were already seated. These were women who wielded local gossip like a refined weapon. They controlled the guest list for the most exclusive galas in the county. If Beatrice could convince these 3 women of her innocence, the rest of the elite social circle would fall into line. Beatrice ordered a mimosa. She did not wait for her peers to inquire about the disastrous events of Saturday evening. She seized the initiative. She lowered her voice, adopting a tone of heartbreaking maternal sorrow. She told them I was profoundly unwell. She leaned across the table and claimed the pressure of the wedding had triggered a severe psychological episode. She wove a seamless fictional tale about her daughter suffering from delusions. She stated that I had hallucinated the financial debt and invented the wild accusations regarding the trust fund. She sighed heavily, dabbing the corner of her eye with a linen napkin. She asked her friends for their prayers and their discretion during this tragic family crisis. She framed my father's physical assault as a panicked attempt to restrain a hysterical woman. The lie was audacious, but it offered her peers a highly convenient exit ramp. The wealthy patrons of the country club preferred the narrative of a tragic mental health crisis over the deeply uncomfortable reality of a bankrupt associate. The rumors began to circulate immediately. The whispers traveled from the dining tables to the locker rooms. The story mutated. Arabella the victim was replaced by Arabella the unstable daughter. I learned about this public relations maneuver 3 hours later. A former colleague who maintained a junior membership at the club sent me a brief, factual message detailing my mother's performance. I sat at my kitchen island and read the message. I felt no surge of anger. A data analyst expects a failing system to output corrupted data. I had anticipated this exact strategy. Beatrice assumed my silence after the wedding meant I had retreated into my new marriage. She failed to understand the basic mechanics of my methodology. I only strike when the target presents a clear, undeniable vulnerability. By utilizing a public social setting to attack my credibility, she had walked directly into my line of sight. It was time to deploy the final set of encrypted files. I opened my laptop. I did not engage in a petty shouting match on social media platforms. I bypassed the rumor mill entirely and targeted the apex of her social hierarchy. I located the official contact roster for the Ridgewood Country Club Board of Directors. These were the men and women who controlled the memberships, the charity allocations, and the social standing of every individual inside that building. I drafted a formal, sterile email. I typed the subject line. It read, "Clarification of legal boundaries and active protective orders." The text of the message was clinical and devoid of emotional rhetoric. I informed the board that due to the events of Saturday evening, an emergency protective order was currently active against William and Beatrice Miller. I stated that I was providing contextual evidence to ensure the club administration understood the severe legal parameters surrounding the family, thereby protecting the establishment from any potential liability. I attached the audio file I had recorded in my dark driveway. The file captured Harrison clearly admitting that the family was facing total ruin. The audio featured his frantic confession explicitly linking his private hard money debts to our parents' imminent survival. He promised that if he went down, they would all go down. I then attached the fraudulent LLC prenuptial agreement. I highlighted the footer on page 14, displaying the name of the corporate litigation firm. The document proved the premeditated nature of their financial coercion. I pressed send. The email landed directly in the inboxes of the most powerful people in her sphere. The board members opened the attachments. They listened to the audio recording. They heard the raw, desperate threats from the Golden Child. They read the predatory legal contract drafted by corporate sharks. The evidence was undeniable. It cut through the weeping victimhood routine with the precision of a surgical blade. The truth was no longer an abstract rumor. It was a digital audio file and a corporate footer. Back at the country club, Beatrice was finishing her second mimosa. She felt a profound sense of triumph. She believed she had successfully rewritten history. Her three friends were nodding in sympathetic agreement, offering quiet words of support. Then the cellular phones began to chime. One by one, the women sitting at the table received text messages from their husbands or their peers on the board of directors. The messages contained swift, brutal instructions. They were told to distance themselves immediately. They were informed that the Millers were not just bankrupt, but legally toxic. I was not present to witness the exact moment the social exile occurred, but the details reached me later with perfect clarity. Beatrice watched as the woman to her left read a message. The woman's expression froze. The color drained from her face. The woman to her right checked her screen and visibly paled. Without saying a single word, the first friend picked up her crystal glass, stood up from her chair, and walked away toward the outdoor patio. The second friend followed suit, her heels clicking rapidly against the hardwood floor. The third friend remained seated for a moment. This was a woman Beatrice had vacationed with for a decade. They had hosted charity galas together. The third friend gathered her designer purse and stood up. She did not offer an excuse. She did not offer an apology. She did not even make eye contact. She simply turned her back and walked out of the dining room. Beatrice was left sitting alone at the corner table. The waitstaff abruptly avoided her section. The other patrons in the dining room lowered their voices, casting sideways glances at the isolated matriarch. The silence in her immediate vicinity was profound. It was not the silence of awe or respect. It was the silence of a strict quarantine. She realized the narrative had collapsed. The evidence had permeated the fortress. Her social annihilation was complete. She could not spin an audio recording. She could not weep away a corporate legal document. The country club board of directors did not wait for the end of the month. They revoked the Miller family membership privileges by the end of the business day. They cited a violation of the conduct clause regarding active protective orders and disruptive behavior. Beatrice walked out of the club for the final time, stepping into the glaring afternoon sun. She returned to the estate with the foreclosure notice still stapled to the door. She had no friends left to call. She had no leverage left to pull. The isolation was total. The conflict was extinguished. The data had neutralized the threat. The only thing remaining was to measure the peace that follows the destruction. 6 months have passed since the heavy oak doors of the country club swung shut, sealing my parents out of the only world they ever valued. It is now late April in Pennsylvania. The harsh winter frost has thawed, giving way to the soft, steady warmth of the arriving spring. The transition of the seasons mirrors the profound shift in my own existence. The frantic, high-stakes anxiety that defined my life for 29 years has evaporated. In its place, I have discovered something entirely unfamiliar. I have discovered silence. Liam and I are sitting on the wide wooden porch of the Craftsman-style house we purchased 3 months ago. The neighborhood is quiet, lined with old maple trees and modest, well-kept lawns. There are no iron gates. There is no homeowners association dictating the approved shade of exterior paint. We own the property outright. Liam is sitting in a rocking chair, carefully sanding the armrest of an antique wooden bench he rescued from an estate sale. He hums a low, steady tune while he works. The sound of the sandpaper gliding over the oak is rhythmic and grounding. I am standing near the edge of the porch holding a small copper watering can. A row of terracotta pots lines the wooden railing. The pot on the far left contains a thriving peppermint plant. I tilt the copper spout and let a steady stream of water soak into the dark soil. The crisp, sharp scent of peppermint rises into the cool evening air. This plant is not a random decorative choice. It is a quiet, deliberate homage. My great-aunt Josephine kept a vibrant peppermint plant on the windowsill of her home office. When I was a child, she would pluck a leaf, crush it between her fingers, and tell me that the scent was designed to clear the mind and sharpen the senses. She claimed it cut through the fog of emotional manipulation and allowed a person to see the board clearly. Every time I water this plant, I breathe in the sharp aroma. I remind myself of her foresight, her quiet intelligence, and her refusal to be intimidated by the illusions of other people. While my peppermint plant thrives in the spring sunlight, the illusion my parents spent decades cultivating has withered entirely. The systemic collapse we predicted on that Monday morning materialized with ruthless efficiency. Financial institutions do not care about social standing. They operate on the unforgiving logic of ledgers and liabilities. When the Hard Money Consortium filed the public notice of default, the primary banks panicked. They froze the home equity lines and demanded immediate repayment on the subprime loans. My parents had zero liquid capital. They had exhausted every favor and alienated every wealthy peer in their social circle. The bank initiated formal foreclosure proceedings without offering a single extension. The public auction took place on the courthouse steps 2 months ago. The sprawling brick colonial estate, the physical anchor of the Miller family myth, was sold to a corporate holding company. The custom mahogany dining table where my father tried to extort my inheritance was liquidated. The velvet sofa where my mother delivered her final threats was sold to an estate liquidator. William and Beatrice Miller were forced to downsize. They relocated to a cramped 2-bedroom condominium on the far outskirts of the county. The complex is situated next to a noisy interstate highway. There are no manicured golf courses. There are no charity luncheons or country club galas. They are living in the harsh, unglamorous reality they spent their entire lives trying to outrun. I do not know the layout of their new condominium. I do not know the color of their walls or the names of their new neighbors. I possess this knowledge only through the sterile updates provided by attorney Nathaniel Pierce. The emergency protective order issued on the night of my wedding was converted into a permanent restraining order. My parents are legally barred from contacting me, approaching my residence, or attempting to communicate through third-party intermediaries. During the first 2 months, Beatrice attempted to circumvent the mandate. She mailed letters lacking a return address. She tried calling from restricted phone numbers. Pierce intercepted every single attempt. He filed formal warnings with the court, informing my parents that any further violations would result in immediate incarceration. The letters stopped arriving. The restricted phone calls ceased. The legal boundary proved impenetrable. The silence that followed was not the tense waiting silence of a battlefield. It was the vast, expansive peace of a war that had definitively ended. Harrison remains an echo. He never returned to Pennsylvania. The private lenders seized his remaining corporate assets and liquidated his downtown loft. He is currently residing in a different time zone, working a mid-level logistics job under a different surname, hiding from the men he defrauded. He traded his arrogant ambition for a life of perpetual paranoia. Aunt Josephine's $3 million trust remains secure. The capital sits in diversified, low-risk portfolios, generating a steady, reliable yield. I did not purchase a sports car or lease a luxury vehicle. I did not upgrade my wardrobe to designer labels. I maintained my position as a senior data analyst, working the same hours and analyzing the same complex systems. However, I did allocate a specific portion of the trust for a singular, highly intentional purpose. I worked alongside Pierce to establish a philanthropic initiative. We named it the Josephine Memorial Data Science Grant. It is a scholarship fund dedicated specifically to young women entering the fields of predictive modeling, statistical analysis, and data engineering. I designed the grant parameters myself. We do not select candidates based on their social connections or their family backgrounds. We select applicants who demonstrate a profound ability to look at a chaotic, broken system and identify the underlying truth. We provide them with full tuition coverage, living stipends, and networking opportunities. I created this scholarship because I understand the exact value of data. Data is a shield. When you are raised in an environment built on gaslighting and emotional coercion, you are trained to doubt your own perception. You are told that your boundaries are selfish. You are told that your intelligence is a threat. You are conditioned to believe the false narrative presented by the people in power. Data removes the emotion from the equation. It allows you to track the burn rate, identify the toxic debt, and read the corporate footers on fraudulent legal documents. It gives you the power to stand in a bridal suite, look manipulation directly in the eye, and recognize it for the desperate illusion it truly is. I want to equip the next generation of women with the analytical tools they need to dismantle the illusions in their own lives. I want them to possess the financial independence to walk away from tables where they are no longer respected. Liam finishes sanding the armrest of the antique bench. He sets the sandpaper down, wipes his hands on his denim apron, and walks over to the railing where I am standing. He wraps his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. We watch the sun dip below the horizon, painting the neighborhood in shades of deep orange and soft violet. We do not speak for a long time. We simply exist in the shared, comfortable quiet. For 29 years, I believed that family loyalty was an unbreakable contract. I believed that you were obligated to absorb the collateral damage of the people who shared your genetics. I was taught that setting a limit was a betrayal, and that protecting my own future was an act of profound selfishness. I had to endure a public assault and orchestrate a systemic financial unmasking to learn the truth. The truth is that unconditional love is a myth, invented by people who want to mistreat you without facing the consequences. Respect is the only metric that matters. If an environment requires you to sacrifice your dignity, your security, or your sanity to maintain the peace, that environment is a trap. I look at the peppermint plant thriving in its terracotta pot. I lean back against my husband, feeling the solid, steady rhythm of his heartbeat. I am safe. The ledger is balanced. The fortress is secure. If your family ever expects you to set yourself on fire to keep their secrets warm, let them freeze. Drop a comment if you have ever had to walk away to save yourself. You are not ruining the family. You are just surviving it.